For 40 years, Beatrice Aldridge lived in a small house at the edge of town, a house her husband Thomas had built for her with his own hands before he was gone. Every month a check arrived in the mail. The Aldridge family called it an allowance. Beatrice called it what it was, a reminder that they saw her as a burden they were obligated to carry. She never complained. She never called. She never asked for more than what they sent. And every night before she turned off the light, her eyes went to the same place. A corner shelf beside her bedroom window, a small cedar box no bigger than a shoebox with a brass lock that had never once been opened. Thomas had made it himself. She could still smell him in the wood. He had given it to her 1 week before he died. He pressed the key into her palm and said, "Beatrice, do not open this until you have to. And when that moment comes, remember that I saw everything coming." She had kept the key on a silver chain around her neck for 40 years, close to her heart, every single day. Until today, Preston Aldridge stood across from her in the family boardroom, 52 years old, tailored suit, the kind of confidence that comes not from building something, but from inheriting it. He folded his hands on the mahogany table and looked at her the way a man looks at an old piece of furniture he has finally decided to throw away. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, "the family has made a decision. We are ending the monthly allowance. You are no longer the responsibility of this family. You have 30 days to vacate the property." The room was silent. Several cousins sat along the wall. None of them looked at her. Beatrice set the cedar box on the table. The sound it made was quiet, almost nothing. But every person in that room looked at it. She was 80 years old. Her hands trembled slightly from age, but her voice when she spoke was steady as timber. "You are right, Preston," she said. "It is time I stopped being a burden, but not in the way you mean." She reached into the collar of her blouse and drew out a silver chain. On the end of it hung a small brass key. She placed it in the lock. The click it made was sharp and clean, like the first crack of wood in a silent forest. She lifted the lid. Inside was a thick stack of documents, yellowed at the edges, held together with a faded ribbon, and beneath them a handwritten letter. She placed the top document on the table and turned it to face Preston. United States Patent Number 4287091, the Aldridge Cedar Seasoning Process. Filed November 3, 1978. Owner Thomas Aldridge. She looked at Preston then, and she smiled. The kind of smile that has waited 40 years to arrive. 40 years ago, she said, "My husband invented the process that built everything this family owns. And for 40 years, not one of you has paid him a single cent." Preston stared at the document. His face did not move, but something behind his eyes did. And this, the letter beneath the patent, was written in Thomas Aldridge's hand 1 week before he died. He had addressed it simply, for Beatrice, to be read when the time comes. The time had come. The Aldridge family knew how to celebrate themselves. The grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel had been transformed for the occasion. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across 60 tables dressed in white linen. Waiters moved between guests carrying trays of champagne. Aldridge timber had stood for 60 years, and the family intended for everyone within driving distance to know it. Preston Aldridge took the stage at 8 o'clock sharp. He was 52, but carried himself like a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. His suit was Italian, his cufflinks were gold, and his smile was the kind that gets practiced in mirrors. He tapped the microphone once, and the room went quiet. 60 years ago, he began. A man stood in a small town in western Oregon with nothing but vision and determination. My grandfather, Clayton Aldridge, built this company from the ground up. From 2 hands and 1 sawmill, he created something that has employed thousands of families, shaped entire communities, and stood the test of time. Aldridge timber is his legacy. It is our legacy. And tonight, we honor that. Applause filled the room. Glasses were raised. Someone near the front let out a cheer. Beatrice sat at a table in the far corner of the ballroom beside a column that partially blocked her view of the stage. She had been placed there the way you place something you are obligated to include, but would rather not look at. Her table had 4 seats. Only one was occupied. She wore a wool jacket she had owned for 11 years. It was clean and carefully pressed, but the fabric at both shoulders had thinned to near transparency. She had not bought a new one because the allowance did not stretch far enough, and she had never once asked for more. She held a glass of water and listened to Preston speak. Not once did he say the name Thomas. Not once. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at that particular absence a long time ago. She simply sat and listened and held her glass and let the omission settle over her like something she had long learned to breathe around. Across the room, Clara Aldridge Bennett caught sight of her. Clara was 49, dark-haired, with her father's careful eyes and something in her expression that did not quite belong at a celebration. She was the family's general counsel, the one who read the fine print when no one else wanted to. She excused herself from a conversation and made her way across the ballroom floor. "Aunt Beatrice," she said, pulling out the chair beside her and sitting without waiting for an invitation. "How are you doing? Did you eat anything?" Beatrice smiled. "I am fine, Clara. The salmon was lovely. You should not be sitting all the way over here." "I am comfortable here." Clara looked at her for a moment longer than a casual glance. There was something she wanted to say Beatrice could tell. There always was with Clara. But before she could find the words, a hand appeared on her shoulder. "Clara?" Preston stood behind her, champagne in a hand, his smile unchanged. "I need you to look at the Mercer acquisition slides before tomorrow morning. The buyer's team flies in at 7. Clara hesitated. "Of course," she said, standing slowly. She touched Beatrice's hand briefly before she left. "I will call you this week," she said quietly. "I promise." Beatrice watched her go. Preston did not look at Beatrice at all. Not a glance, not a nod. She was as invisible to him as the column beside her. Later, on the 4th floor of the hotel in a corner office that had been reserved for family use, Raymond Aldridge sat in his wheelchair by the window. He was 92 years old and had survived 2 heart surgeries, a stroke, and 60 years of watching his family become something he no longer entirely recognized. His mind remained clear, even as his body had grown small and slow. He watched the world with the patience of a man who understood that most things reveal themselves eventually. Preston came in without knocking. Raymond did not turn from the window. "The sale is moving forward," Preston said. "The offer from the multinational is strong. We should be able to close within the quarter." He paused. "I am also ending the allowance to Beatrice, and the property she is living on will need to be listed. It is time to clean up what is left over from the past." Raymond was quiet for a long moment. "Do not do this, Preston," he said finally. His voice was thin but steady. "It is a business decision, Opa. It is not personal." Raymond turned from the window then. His eyes, pale and deep-set, settled on his grandson with an expression that was not anger. It was something older than anger. It was the look of a man who has known a secret for 40 years and has never stopped feeling the weight of it. "Some things," he said slowly, "should not be cleaned up." Preston set his champagne glass on the desk and checked his watch. "The car is ready," he said. "We should get you back to the residence." Raymond said nothing more. He let them wheel him out. But as they passed through the lobby and into the night air, he turned his head and looked through the glass doors back into the ballroom. Near the far exit, a driver was helping an elderly woman into the back of a car, a small woman in a worn wool jacket. She moved carefully, one hand on the doorframe. Raymond watched until the car disappeared. He had been watching her leave rooms for 40 years, and he had never once said what he knew. The drive back to her house took 20 minutes. Beatrice did not speak during the ride. She looked out the window at the dark fields and the lines of cedar trees that ran along the highway black against the blue of the night sky. Thomas had loved those trees. He used to pull over on that very road just to stand at the edge of the field and press his hand against the bark. He said he could feel the age of a tree just by touching it. He said wood had a memory. The driver pulled into her narrow gravel driveway and helped her to the door. She thanked him by name, as she always did. He tipped his hat as he always did. Inside, the house was quiet and warm. She moved through the dark hallway without turning on a light. She knew every step. In the bedroom, she reached for the lamp on the nightstand and clicked it on. The soft light filled the small room and landed as it always did on the corner shelf beside the window. The cedar box sat where it had always sat. A fine layer of dust had settled on the lid. The brass lock caught the lamplight and held it. Beatrice stood at the foot of her bed and looked at it for a long time. Then she crossed the room slowly and she reached out, and for the first time in years she placed both hands on the lid of the box. The wood was smooth and cool beneath her palms. She could still smell it faintly. Cedar and sawdust and something else she had no name for, something that belonged only to Thomas. She did not open it, not yet, but she whispered to the quiet room, to the wood, to whoever might still be listening after 40 years. Perhaps, she said softly, perhaps it is time, Thomas. The lamp flickered once very slightly, the way old lamps sometimes do. Then the room was still. The memory came to her the way it always did. Not as something distant, but as something that had never quite left. October 1984. The house smelled of fresh cedar and sawdust and the particular warmth of a wood stove, burning for the first time in a new home. Thomas had built this house himself, not hired it out, not supervised from a distance. He had laid every board set, every beam driven, every nail. His hands showed it. They were broad and calloused and permanently darkened at the knuckles, the hands of a man who worked not because he had to, but because he could not imagine being any other way. He was 46 years old that October, still lean, still quick to laugh, still the kind of man who would stop in the middle of a sentence to listen to birdsong through an open window. He set the cedar box on the table between them. It was new then. The wood was pale gold, fragrant with resin, the grain running in long, clean lines that Thomas had chosen himself from the lumber yard. The brass lock was bright and unscratched. He had made the box in his workshop over the course of 3 evenings, working by lamplight after supper, while Beatrice grated papers at the kitchen table. She had not asked what he was making. She had learned over the years of their marriage that Thomas built things in his own time and explained them in his own way. He sat down across from her now and folded his calloused hands on the table and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not worry exactly. It was something more deliberate than worry. It was the expression of a man who has thought something all the way through to the end and arrived at a decision he is at peace with. "I want you to keep this," he said. She looked at the box, then back at him. "But I need you to promise me something first," he said. She waited. "Do not open it," he said. "Not until you have to. You will know when that moment comes. And when it does, do not be afraid of what is inside." Beatrice studied his face. She had been married to this man for 10 years. She knew the difference between Thomas being secretive and Thomas being careful. This was careful, deeply, deliberately careful. "What is inside it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. It was a gentle smile and a sad one, the smile of a man carrying knowledge that he would rather not carry, but has made his peace with. "Justice," he said, "and time." She did not press him further. That was the nature of what they had built together. She trusted him the way you trust something load-bearing. Not blindly, not without thought, but with the full weight of everything you know about a person, all the years of watching them choose over and over again to be honest and good. She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "All right," she said, "I promise." He nodded slowly. His hands turned beneath hers and held them. "Thank you, Beatrice," he said quietly. "That is all I needed." 1 week later, on a Tuesday morning in late October, while Beatrice stood at a chalkboard in front of 23 third graders, Thomas Aldridge died at the sawmill. The school principal came to her classroom door just before noon. She saw his face before he spoke, and she knew. She asked a colleague to watch her students, and she walked to her car, and she drove to the hospital, and she did not cry until she was in the parking lot and could not move her hands from the steering wheel. By the time she reached the corridor outside the room where Thomas had been taken, Clayton and Raymond were already there. Clayton was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit, as though he had dressed for the occasion. Raymond stood slightly behind him, thinner, quieter, his eyes moving to Beatrice and then away. Clayton spoke first. "Thomas did not leave anything to you," he said. "There was no will. He owned no shares in the company. He was an employee, Beatrice, not a partner. He had no assets to leave. He looked at her with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite contempt, but held elements of both. However, out of respect for what he meant to this family, we will provide you with a monthly allowance. It is not a legal obligation. It is a courtesy. Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. Her classroom chalk dust was still on the sleeve of her jacket. She did not argue. She did not ask questions. She thanked him, which cost her something she would not name, and she walked back down the corridor and out through the hospital doors and into the gray October afternoon. She drove home. The house was very quiet. The wood stove had gone cold. She stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at the cedar box on the shelf. In the hours since she had last seen it, everything had changed. Thomas was gone. Clayton had spoken. The world had arranged itself into a shape she did not yet fully understand. But standing there in the doorway, Beatrice understood something she had not quite grasped before. Thomas had known. Not that he would die on that particular Tuesday, perhaps, but he had known that something would come. He had known his brothers. He had known what they were capable of. And he had built her something before it happened. Not a house this time. Something smaller and more permanent. She stood before the shelf and looked at the box for a long time. "If you are watching Thomas," she said to the quiet room, "I want you to know I understand. I do not know everything yet, but I understand enough." She smoothed the front of her jacket. "I will wait," she said, "however long it takes." She turned off the bedroom light and went to make herself a cup of tea because life continued, and she had always believed in continuing. The key rested against her heart. 40 years of waiting had just begun. 40 years do not pass all at once. They pass the way Cedar weathers. Slowly, quietly, one season at a time, until one day you look and the color has changed completely. 1985. Aldridge Timber took out a full-page advertisement in 3 regional newspapers. The headline read, "The Aldridge Cedar Seasoning Process. The Secret Behind Perfection." There was a photograph of Clayton standing in the main warehouse, one hand resting on a stack of finished lumber, smiling the smile of a man who has built something he is proud of. The advertisement described the process in careful technical language. It credited the company. It credited the Aldridge name. It did not mention Thomas once. Beatrice read the advertisement at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her. She read it twice. Then she folded the newspaper carefully and placed it in a drawer beneath the cedar box and went to school, because she had 23 students waiting, and they needed her more than she needed to sit with her anger. 1990. A boy was born to Clayton's son and his wife. They named him Preston Clayton Aldridge. At the celebration dinner, Clayton stood at the head of the table and raised a glass and said that this child would one day lead the company into the next century. The room applauded. Someone took photographs. Beatrice was not invited to the dinner. She learned about it from a brief mention in the local paper. 1998. She retired from teaching. 31 years in the same classroom, the same chalkboard, the same particular smell of pencil shavings and construction paper, and the particular hopeful chaos of children learning things for the first time. On her last day, her students made her a card. She kept it on the kitchen windowsill for years. The allowance checks continued to arrive on the first of every month. The amount had not changed in over a decade. Groceries had become more expensive. Heating oil had become more expensive. The check had not grown to account for any of it. She adjusted her habits and said nothing. 2005. Raymond came to see her. He was 81 years old by then, moving slowly but still upright, still carrying himself with the careful dignity of a man who had spent his life in boardrooms. He sat in her small living room in the chair nearest the window, and he held his hat in both hands, and he did not look at her directly. She brought him tea. She sat across from him. She waited. He was quiet for a very long time. "I am sorry, Beatrice," he said finally. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who has rehearsed something and found that rehearsal was no preparation at all. She looked at him steadily. "For what, Raymond?" she asked. She was not being cruel. She genuinely wanted to know which part of it he was apologizing for. He opened his mouth, closed it. set his teacup down on the saucer with great care. Then he stood put on his hat and left. She watched his car pull away from the gravel drive. She stood at the window for a long time after it was gone. He had said he was sorry. He had not said for what. He had not said what he knew. He had not said what he had kept quiet all those years. But she had seen it in his face. Whatever it was not small. 2012. Clayton Aldridge died in February at 88 in the bedroom of the family estate. The funeral was held at St. Michael's Church on a cold, gray morning. The pews were full. Half the town came, or so it seemed, along with business associates from Portland and Seattle, and as far as San Francisco. Beatrice sat in the last pew. She had dressed carefully as she always did. She folded her hands in her lap, and she listened to the eulogies which spoke of vision and courage and the American spirit of enterprise. She did not hear Thomas's name. She had not expected to. When it was over, she walked out alone into the February cold. Several people passed her on the steps. None of them spoke to her. She walked to her car, started the engine, and drove home. She made soup for supper, and she did not cry. 2020. Preston became CEO. He sent a letter to inform her that due to a restructuring of family finances, the monthly allowance would be reduced by 50% effective immediately. The letter was signed by his assistant. Beatrice read it standing at the kitchen counter. She set it down. She stood there for a moment. Then she made a note in her household ledger and began calculating which expenses she could reduce. She did not call to protest. She did not write back. She had learned over the decades that protest required a foundation to stand on, and she was still waiting for hers. But there was a morning in 2010 that she had not forgotten and would not forget. A young journalist had come to the house. He was writing a piece on the history of Aldridge Timber for a regional magazine tracing the company from its origins through its expansion. Someone had given him her name. He sat across from her in the same chair where Raymond had once sat, and he asked about Thomas with genuine curiosity, his pen poised over his notebook. What was he like, the journalist asked. As an engineer, as an inventor. What did he contribute? Beatrice had looked at the young man for a long moment, and then without fully planning to, she had stood and crossed to the bedroom doorway and looked at the cedar box on the shelf. Her hand went to the key at her throat. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she stepped back into the living room and sat down. Not yet, she said quietly. She was not certain whether she was speaking to the journalist or to herself or to Thomas. The journalist left an hour later with a polite but largely empty interview. She walked him to the door and thanked him for coming and closed the door and stood in the hallway alone. And then for the first time in 26 years, she cried. Not from grief, though grief was present. She cried because she was 76 years old, and she had been waiting for a moment she could not name, and she did not know how much waiting she had left in her. She cried because Thomas had told her she would know when the time came, and she was beginning to be afraid that she would run out of time before the moment arrived. She sat with it for a while. Then she washed her face, made her tea, and continued. Now it was tonight. The ballroom, the chandeliers, Preston on the stage speaking about Clayton's vision and saying nothing about the man who had made that vision possible. Beatrice sat in her bedroom. The house was quiet around her. She reached up to the shelf and lifted the cedar box down for the first time in years. A thin layer of dust rose into the lamplight as she set it on the bed before her. She brushed the lid gently with the back of her hand. Then she picked up the telephone from the nightstand. She had kept the number written on a small card in the back of her address book for 40 years. She had never dialed it. She had always known she would know when to. The line rang twice. A man's voice answered. Careful, unhurried, still sharp. Vance speaking. Beatrice closed her eyes briefly. Mr. Vance, she said. This is Beatrice Aldridge. I believe it is time. A pause on the other end. Then quietly the sound of something that might have been relief. I have been waiting for this call for 40 years, Mrs. Aldridge, Harold Vance said. Tell me when and where, and I will be there. The contract was 412 pages long, and Preston had not read most of it. That was what lawyers were for. That was what Clara was for, and the two outside counsel firms he had retained, and Jessica Morningside's team from North Star's legal department, who had been reviewing Aldridge Timber's assets and liabilities for the better part of 6 months. Preston's role in this process, as he understood it, was to be present, to be confident, and to sign where indicated. He was good at all three. The conference room on the 31st floor of the Aldridge building had been prepared that morning. Water and coffee on the credenza. 4 copies of the acquisition agreement stacked at the center of the table. The city spread out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray and glittering under an overcast sky. North Star's delegation arrived at 9. Morningside led them in. She was 55, compact, precise, with reading glasses on a thin gold chain, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where everything costs something. She shook Preston's hand without warmth and took her seat and opened her briefcase. Clara sat to Preston's left. Raymond had been brought in by a private nurse and positioned near the window in his wheelchair, slightly apart from the table present as a formality, as family elder and company founder's surviving brother. He had said very little since arriving. He held a glass of water in both hands and looked out the window. They worked through the document section by section. Morningside's associate called out page numbers. Counsel on both sides confirmed language. Preston initialed where he was asked to initial. The morning moved efficiently. Then Morningside turned to a tabbed section near the middle of the document, and she stopped. She read the page in front of her once. Then she turned back 2 pages and read something again. Then she removed her reading glasses from their chain and held them in one hand and looked across the table at Preston. "The core technology underlying your company's premium Cedar product line," she said. "The Aldridge Cedar seasoning process. We need to discuss ownership of the underlying patent." Preston leaned back slightly. "That technology belongs to Aldridge Timber. It has been the foundation of our Cedar operations for over 40 years. Morningside set her glasses on the table. "Our intellectual property team conducted a full patent search as part of standard due diligence," she said. "United States Patent Number 4, 287091. Filed November 3, 1978. The registered owner of record is not Aldridge Timber. It is Thomas Aldridge, an individual." The room was very quiet. Preston's expression did not change immediately. It shifted the way ice shifts before it breaks a subtle internal movement, before anything visible occurs on the surface. "Thomas was my great-uncle," he said. "He worked for the company. Whatever he invented as an employee of this family's enterprise." Morningside opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "The patent filing predates the incorporation of Aldridge Timber as a legal entity by 22 months. Under the terms of the patent, and I am reading directly here, any commercial use of this process by any party other than the named inventor requires royalty payments of 12% of gross revenue to Thomas Aldridge or his designated heirs." She looked at Preston. "There is no record of any such payments having been made in 40 years of commercial application." Preston stared at the document. "He is dead," Preston said. "Thomas has been dead for 40 years. There is no one to make a claim." Clara's voice came from his left, quiet and precise. "There is a surviving spouse," she said. She had not looked up from the document in front of her. Her hands were very still on the table. "A legal spouse named as primary heir in the absence of a registered will to the contrary. Beatrice Aldridge." She paused. "She does not need to make a formal claim to effect this transaction, Preston. She only needs to inform North Star that the claim exists." Morningside was watching this exchange with the neutral attention of someone who has seen many rooms break apart and has learned to simply observe. Preston's chair scraped back from the table as he stood. 40 years, he said. "The company used this process for 40 years and she never said a word. Not once. She took the checks we sent her and she said nothing." Clara set down her pen. "Because she did not know what she had," she said. "Or because she was waiting." Preston turned to Raymond. The old man had not moved from his position by the window. He was looking at his water glass. His hands wrapped around it were very still for a man whose hands usually trembled. "You knew," Preston said. His voice had changed. The boardroom confidence was gone. What was underneath it was younger and rawer and considerably less composed. You knew about this. All of you knew. Raymond raised his eyes slowly from the glass. He looked at his grandson, and his expression was not defensive. It was not apologetic. It was the expression of a man who has carried a true thing for a very long time and has simply grown too old and too tired to carry it in the same direction. "I told you," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I told you not to do this." The room held the silence for a moment. Then Preston straightened his jacket. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, but there was something running beneath it, something fast-moving and not entirely rational. "I am going to speak to her directly," he said. "Today. She is 80 years old, and she does not understand what she is sitting on. I will explain the situation, and she will sign a release, and this transaction will proceed." He was already moving toward the door. Clara did not move for a moment. She looked at the patent document on the table before her. She looked at the royalty clause at the figure of 12%, and she did the kind of arithmetic that a general counsel does automatically, the arithmetic that accounts for 40 years and hundreds of millions of dollars in gross Cedar revenue. Then she picked up her phone. The line rang 3 times. "Aunt Beatrice," she said when the soft voice answered. "It is Clara. I need you to listen to me carefully." She kept her voice level. She was a lawyer. She knew how to keep her voice level. "Preston is on his way to you," she said. "There is something you should know before he arrives. The patent, Thomas's patent, it has come up in the North Star transaction." Clara paused. "I think you may already know what I am about to tell you." On the other end of the line, Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said gently, "I believe I do." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "Is Mr. Vance with you?" she asked. "He arrives within the hour," Beatrice said. Clara exhaled slowly. Then she said something she had not planned to say, something that arrived without preparation. "I am sorry, Aunt Beatrice," she said, "for all of it, for all of us." There was a brief pause. "I know you are dear," Beatrice said. "That is why I am glad it is you calling." Harold Vance arrived at 7:30, just as the last light was leaving the sky. Beatrice heard his car on the gravel and went to the door before he could knock. He was older than she had expected, though she did not know why she had expected otherwise. 40 years had passed for him, the same as they had for everyone. He was tall and slightly stooped, with thick silver hair and glasses with heavy frames that had gone out of fashion sometime in the 90s and never quite come back. He carried a worn leather briefcase in one hand and held his hat in the other, and when he saw her in the doorway, he stopped for a moment, as though he needed a second to reconcile the woman in front of him with the woman he had been carrying in his mind for 4 decades. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "Mr. Vance," she said, "please come in." She brought tea without asking whether he wanted any. He sat at the kitchen table and set the briefcase beside his chair and did not open it immediately. He looked around the small kitchen with the careful attention of a man taking inventory, noting the worn edges of things, the tidiness that comes not from abundance, but from the habit of making do with what you have. "Thomas built this house," Beatrice said, setting the cups down. "Yes," Vance said. "He told me about it. He said he built it so it would last 100 years. He paused. "He said he wanted to make sure you would always have somewhere that was yours." Beatrice sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup. "How long did you know him?" she asked. "We met in 1976, Vance said. He came to my office to ask about patent law. He was the most methodical person I had ever sat across from. He had already done more research than most clients do after 6 months of legal consultation. He knew exactly what he wanted to protect and exactly how to protect it. He smiled slightly at the memory. He also brought me a piece of cedar he had treated himself to show me the quality. I still have it on my desk." Beatrice smiled. "That sounds like Thomas." Vance reached down and opened the briefcase. He withdrew a manila envelope, the old kind with a metal clasp thick with age, the paper gone soft at the edges. He placed it on the table between them. "He gave me this in October 1984, Vance said. 1 week before he died. He told me to keep it sealed. He told me that when you called, I would know the time had come, and I should bring it to you unopened." He looked at her over his glasses. "I have kept that instruction for 40 years, Mrs. Aldrich. I have moved offices twice. I have had this envelope in a fireproof safe since 1991. Not a day has passed that I did not think about it." Beatrice looked at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in Thomas's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere. The particular way he made his capital B slightly taller than it needed to be, as though it was reaching for something. She reached out and undid the metal clasp. They went through the contents together, Vance laying each document on the table and explaining what it was, though Beatrice found that she needed less explanation than he perhaps expected. The first was a certified copy of United States Patent 4287091, filed November 3, 1978. Thomas's name, Thomas's signature, the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The royalty clause was on page 3. 12% of gross revenue payable to Thomas Aldrich or his surviving heirs for any commercial application of the described process. The second was Thomas's laboratory journal. 3 years of entries, 1977 through 1979, written in his close, careful hand, documenting every stage of the development of the Cedar seasoning process. Temperature readings, moisture calculations, failure notes, adjustments, the slow, methodical progress of a man who worked alone and kept records the way other people keep promises. The pages had yellowed at the edges, but the writing was clear and the dates were unambiguous. Beatrice held the journal for a long time. She turned the pages, slowly reading fragments, recognizing the rhythm of his handwriting, the way he abbreviated certain words, the small pencil sketches he made in the margins when language was not sufficient. She had not seen his handwriting in 40 years. She set the journal down carefully. The third document was a photocopy of the Aldridge Timber Board meeting minutes from January 15, 1979. 3 pages. At the bottom of the third page were 2 signatures, Clayton Aldridge, Raymond Aldridge. Above the signatures, a resolution authorizing the company to formally adopt the Aldrich Cedar seasoning process into its commercial production line, citing its exceptional results in field trials. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the signatures were legible. The date was legible. The resolution language was legible. They knew, Beatrice said. She was not asking. They knew from the beginning, Vance said. Clayton understood exactly what he was taking. He believed that with Thomas gone and no one pressing the claim, the patent would simply become irrelevant. He believed time would take care of it. He looked at her steadily. He did not account for Thomas having prepared for precisely this situation. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. She looked at the documents spread across her kitchen table. 40 years of her life accounted for in 3 pieces of paper and a laboratory journal. "If I had opened the box in 1984, she said. "If I had come forward immediately." Vance shook his head before she finished. "They would have moved against you," he said. Clayton had the resources and the connections and no hesitation about using them. In 1984, with no legal support, no financial foundation, and a patent claim that would have seemed like the grief of a widow, you would have been buried. They would have found a way to invalidate the filing, discredit the documentation, or simply outlast you in court. He folded his hands on the table. Thomas understood that. He was not a naive man. He knew that the only way this worked was if they built the empire first, if they made themselves so large and so dependent on his process that the truth became too significant to suppress. Beatrice sat with that for a moment. He thought of everything she said quietly. "He loved you," Vance said simply, and he was angry, not a loud anger, the quiet kind that makes a man very precise. She looked at the laboratory journal again. She could picture him writing it. Lamp on late at night, the smell of cedar coming through the workshop door, making his notes with the same attention he gave to everything he cared about. She had not let herself think about him this directly in a long time. It was easier most days to keep the grief at a certain distance, to function around it rather than through it. But tonight she let herself sit with him for a moment in the kitchen he had built, at the table he had built with the documents he had prepared to protect her. She pressed her hand flat against the cover of the laboratory journal. Then she stood. She crossed to the corner shelf in the hallway and lifted the cedar box down with both hands. She carried it back to the kitchen and set it on the table beside the documents in the lamplight where everything could be seen clearly. "Tomorrow," she said. She straightened slightly the way a person straightens when they have made a decision that has been a long time coming. "Tomorrow Thomas will have his say." Vance looked at the cedar box and then at the woman standing before him, and he nodded once. "I will be there," he said, "with everything we need." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the cedar trees at the edge of the property stood dark against the night sky, the same trees Thomas had planted the year they married, the same trees that had grown tall and silent while 40 years passed and the world changed around them. They had outlasted a great deal already. The next morning came gray and still. Oregon light slipped through the clouds without ceremony, turning the city windows silver and the streets below the Aldridge headquarters into wet lines of stone and glass. Beatrice was dressed by 6. She wore the same wool jacket she had worn to the anniversary celebration, the one with the thinning shoulders and the carefully mended cuff. It was the best jacket she owned. She saw no reason to pretend otherwise now. On the kitchen table beside her tea sat the cedar box. For 40 years it had waited in the quiet corners of her life, on closet shelves, under beds, inside cabinets, beside moving boxes. Through winter storms, unpaid bills, holidays spent alone, and birthdays nobody from the Aldridge family remembered. Thomas had told her not to open it until she had to. And last night when Harold Vance placed the first document under the lamp and read the clause aloud, Beatrice finally understood why. She did not sleep much, but she did not tremble either. At 7:15, Vance arrived in a dark suit carrying his briefcase. He did not offer unnecessary comfort. He only looked at the cedar box on the table, then at Beatrice. "Are you ready?" he asked. Beatrice fastened the small brass key around her neck beneath her collar. "No," she said quietly, but Thomas was. They drove to Aldridge Timber in silence. Preston had called the family meeting for 9 o'clock. By then, he had already made his preparations. Clara had warned Beatrice the night before in one short message. "He is bringing the family attorney. He is bringing a check. He wants you to sign before anything can be filed." Beatrice had read the message once. Then she had turned off the lamp and gone to bed. The boardroom was the same one where Preston had told her she had 30 days to leave her home. Same mahogany table, same tall windows, same city view beyond the glass. But this morning the room felt different, because everyone had seen the box. Preston stood at the head of the table, dressed like a man who believed tailoring could disguise panic. His attorney, Gerald Frost, sat beside him with a folder already open. Several cousins lined the wall. Clara sat near the window, her hands folded, her face pale but steady. Raymond Aldridge sat in the corner, his wheelchair angled slightly away from the table. He looked smaller than he had the day before, not weaker. Smaller, as though the truth had already begun removing things from him. Beatrice walked in with Vance at her side and the cedar box under her arm. Conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes followed the box. Not Beatrice. The box. That was when she knew they understood. Maybe not everything, but enough to be afraid. She crossed the room and placed the cedar box at the far end of the table directly opposite Preston. The sound was soft, wood against polished wood. But in that room it landed like a judge's gavel. Preston spoke first. "Of course he did." "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, forcing warmth into his voice, "I'm glad you came. I think we can resolve this as a family matter before it becomes anything unnecessary." Beatrice looked at him. For a moment she saw not the CEO of Aldridge Timber, but the boy who had once come to her house with his grandfather and refused the cookies she offered because Clayton had taught him not to accept anything from her. Preston gestured toward the attorney. "Gerald has prepared a fair arrangement, a revised monthly allowance, a lifetime right to remain in the house, and a generous settlement in exchange for a simple acknowledgement that all company intellectual property belongs cleanly to Aldridge Timber." He pushed a folder across the table. "Then a check." Beatrice did not look down. Preston continued softer now. "Whatever you think you have in that box, I'm sure we can address it privately." That was the mistake. Privately. Beatrice rested one hand on the cedar lid. "Preston," she said, "for 40 years your family sent me checks and called it kindness." The room went still. Not one of you came to ask what Thomas was like. Not one of you asked what he built. Not one of you asked why he made this box with his own hands and told me not to open it until the day I had no other choice. She looked at the check on the table. "Today is not private. And this stopped being a family matter the day your grandfather decided my husband's work belonged to him." Preston's expression tightened. "Careful," he said. Beatrice gave him the smallest smile. "No," she said. "That is what Thomas was." She drew the silver chain from beneath her collar. The brass key caught the gray morning light. Across the room, Raymond closed his eyes. Beatrice placed the key into the lock. The click was sharp. "Clean. Final." She lifted the lid. Nobody moved. Inside the cedar box, the papers lay arranged in careful order, just as Vance had placed them the night before. Beatrice took out the first document, heavy paper. Formal seal, typewritten lines. She placed it on the table and turned it toward Preston. "United States Patent number 4287091, she said. "The Aldridge Cedar Seasoning Process, filed November 3rd, 1978. Owner of record, Thomas Aldridge." Preston said nothing. Beatrice tapped one page with her finger. "Page 3 contains a royalty clause. 12% of gross commercial revenue for any use of this process payable to Thomas Aldridge or his heirs." Gerald Frost leaned forward. Vance opened his briefcase. "My husband filed this before Aldridge Timber existed as a legal company," Beatrice continued. "Before your grandfather incorporated it, before the first commercial cedar contracts were signed." She placed the second document beside the first. "This is Thomas's laboratory journal, 1977 through 1979. Every test, every formula, every failed batch, every final adjustment, in his handwriting." She placed the third document down. "And this is the January 15th, 1979 board meeting record, the day Aldridge Timber formally adopted Thomas's process into commercial production." Her voice did not rise. "That was what made it worse." At the bottom are two signatures, Clayton Aldridge and Raymond Aldridge. The room shifted toward Raymond, but Beatrice did not look at him yet. Preston gripped the edge of the table. "That doesn't prove theft," he said. "Thomas worked with the company. Any development would have been part of company operations." Vance spoke for the first time. "No," he said. One word. "Flat." "Controlled." The patent was filed privately under Thomas Aldridge's individual name before incorporation. It was not a work-for-hire filing. It was not assigned to the company. And we have a complete chain of custody for every document in this box. He placed a bound legal folder on the table. "If necessary, I can file within the hour." Preston looked at Frost. Frost did not reassure him. That frightened him more than Beatrice could have. Preston turned back to her. "You still can't prove they knew what they were agreeing to." Beatrice had been waiting for that sentence. So had Thomas. She reached into the box again. This time she removed a single handwritten letter. One page, yellowed at the edges. Dated January 12th, 1979. 3 days before the board meeting. She did not read it aloud at first. She simply placed it in front of Preston. "Read it," she said. Preston stared at the page. Then he read. His face changed before he finished the first paragraph. The room watched him become less certain in real time. The letter was from Clayton to Raymond. It discussed the patent directly. It discussed the royalty clause by percentage. And near the bottom in Clayton Aldridge's own handwriting was the sentence Thomas had preserved for 40 years. "We will proceed with adoption. Thomas will not make trouble. He does not have the resources to fight us, and he knows it." Clara covered her mouth. One of the cousins whispered something and then stopped. Preston sat back slowly. For the first time since Beatrice had entered the room, he looked young. Not innocent, just unprepared. Beatrice looked at him and felt no triumph, only a deep, tired sadness, because Thomas had been right. That was the hardest part. Not that the family had stolen from him, but that he had known they would, and he had loved Beatrice enough to plan beyond his own life. Preston's voice came out lower. "This letter could be challenged." Vance said everything can be challenged. That is why courts exist. Beatrice put her hand on the cedar box. But your buyer won't wait for a court. The word struck the room harder than any accusation. Preston's eyes lifted. Beatrice continued. The multinational group purchasing Aldridge Timber is in due diligence this week. If Mr. Vance notifies them that the company's core commercial process may carry 40 years of unpaid royalty exposure, the sale will pause by lunch. No one spoke, and once their attorneys read Clayton's letter, she said they will not ask whether the claim is inconvenient. They will ask why your family hid it. Preston stood. This is blackmail. Beatrice looked at him. No, she said. Blackmail is when someone uses a lie to force silence. She touched the patent. This is when silence finally ends. A sound came from the corner. Small, rough, human. Everyone turned. Raymond Aldridge had lifted his head. His hands trembled on the arms of his wheelchair. His face had gone pale, but his eyes were clear. She can prove it, he said. Preston stared at him. Uncle Raymond? Raymond's voice sharpened just enough to cut him off. She can prove it because it is true. The room froze. Raymond looked at Beatrice, not at the box, not at the papers, at Beatrice. I have been silent for 40 years, he said, because I was afraid of my brother, because Clayton built the company and I helped him keep it, because I told myself Thomas was gone and that nothing could be changed. His breath caught. No one moved. I told myself we provided for you, that the checks made it less ugly, that if you had a roof and a little money, then maybe it was not theft. He shook his head slowly. But it was theft. Preston's face hardened. Stop talking. Raymond did not. We read the patent, he said. Clayton and I. We saw the clause. We knew Thomas had filed it privately. Clayton said Thomas would never fight us. He said Beatrice would never understand the documents. He said grief would make her quiet. Beatrice felt something move through her chest. Not anger, not relief. Something older than both. Raymond's eyes filled. We built Aldridge Timber on what Thomas made. We put his name in speeches when it suited us and erased him from the records when it mattered. We gave his wife checks so she would look cared for, while we kept what belonged to her. He looked at Preston then. Your grandfather stole from Thomas. His voice broke, but he finished. And I helped him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything the Aldridge family had refused to say for 4 decades. Clara was crying quietly now. Gerald Frost closed his folder. Preston looked around the room, searching for someone who would stand with him. No one did. Beatrice looked at Raymond for a long moment. She did not forgive him. Not there. Not like that. Forgiveness was too large a word to hand out in a boardroom. But she nodded once, a small acknowledgement. A true thing had finally been spoken. Raymond bowed his head. I am sorry, Beatrice, he whispered. She looked down at the cedar box. The wood was smooth beneath her hand. Thomas had sanded it himself. She remembered that now. The evenings in the workshop, the smell of cedar in his hair, the way he had smiled when she asked what it was for. One day he had said, you'll know. For 40 years she had thought the box was proof that Thomas trusted her. Now she understood something deeper. It was proof that Thomas had known her, known she would wait, known she would not waste it on anger, known that when the day finally came, she would not need to destroy them to prove he had existed. Beatrice closed the lid of the box. The click was softer this time. She turned to Preston. Mr. Vance will send formal notice to the purchasing group by noon, she said, unless Aldridge Timber agrees to discuss terms. Preston swallowed. What terms? Beatrice picked up the check he had pushed toward her earlier. She looked at it once. Then she tore it cleanly in half. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply as if disposing of something that had never been enough. My husband did not build this company so your family could buy my silence, she said. He built something that should have carried his name. Outside the tall windows, the gray Oregon sky began to clear. For the first time that morning, light touched the table. It fell across the patent, across the handwritten letter, across the cedar box, and finally across Beatrice's hands, the same hands that had carried that box for 40 years. the same hands that now rested on the truth Thomas had left behind. Beat 6 ended not with shouting, not with victory, but with the sound of a room understanding that the widow they had dismissed had not come to beg. She had come with the one thing they could not outspend: proof. For a long moment after Raymond's confession, no one moved. The boardroom seemed to have lost its air. Preston stood at the head of the table with both hands pressed against the polished wood, as if the room itself had tilted, and he was trying not to fall. The anger had not left his face, but it had nowhere to go now. Not toward Beatrice, not toward Vance, not even toward Raymond, because the oldest man in the room had just taken the last defense away from him. Raymond had not accused the family. He had confessed for it. Clara wiped her face once with the back of her hand and looked down at the patent on the table. For years she had reviewed contracts, licensing agreements, acquisition files, and regulatory disclosures for Aldridge Timber. She had seen the name Thomas Aldridge in company history pieces, in anniversary brochures, in carefully polished speeches given at charity dinners. A visionary technician, a loyal brother, a contributor, never owner, never inventor, never the man whose work had made the company possible. Now the truth sat in front of her in black ink and old handwriting. Beatrice remained standing beside the cedar box. She did not look victorious. That unsettled Preston more than anything else. If she had shouted, he could have called her unstable. If she had threatened him, he could have called her bitter. If she had wept, he could have made himself look generous. But Beatrice Aldridge simply stood there, one hand resting on the box her husband had built, calm in a way that made every lie in the room seem smaller. Vance closed the legal folder in front of him. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said quietly, "with your permission." Beatrice nodded. Vance opened his laptop. The sound of the computer starting seemed absurdly ordinary in the silence that followed Raymond's confession. A few keys clicked, then another. Vance connected a small cable to the conference screen at the far end of the room. Preston stiffened.
"What are you doing?"
Vance did not look up, notifying an interested party. The large screen blinked once, then filled with the image of a woman in a dark blazer seated in a glass-walled office. Behind her, a city skyline rose in pale morning light. Her expression was composed, professional, and entirely unaware that the sale she had been negotiating for months was about to change in less than 5 minutes. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you directly." Ms. Morningside Vance said thank you for taking the call. Preston's face went white. Clara whispered Jessica Morningside. One of the cousins looked confused. Vance explained it for everyone. Jessica Morningside, Senior Acquisition Counsel for North Star Consolidated Holdings. The name moved through the room like cold water. North Star. The buyer. The multinational firm that had been preparing to purchase Aldridge Timber for a sum Preston had repeated so often that half the family had already begun spending money they did not yet have. Preston took a step forward. "End the call." Vance ignored him. "Ms. Morningside," he said, "I am speaking on behalf of my client, Mrs. Beatrice Aldridge, lawful heir to United States Patent, number 4287091, known commercially as the Aldridge Cedar seasoning process." The woman on the screen did not move, but something in her eyes changed. Vance continued. "We are formally notifying North Star that Aldridge Timber has used this patented process in commercial production for approximately 40 years without documented royalty payment to the patent holder or his heir." Preston's voice came out sharp. "This is a family dispute." Jessica Morningside looked past Vance toward Preston. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "please let counsel finish." Vance clicked once. A scanned copy of the patent appeared on the screen. Then the royalty clause. Then Thomas's laboratory journal. Then the board minutes. Then Clayton's letter. Jessica read in silence. No one else in the room seemed to breathe. Finally, Vance said, "Based on preliminary revenue exposure, unpaid royalties may exceed $300 million before interest penalties, litigation costs, or acquisition disclosure consequences are calculated." $300 million. The number entered the boardroom without drama. That was what made it devastating. It was not shouted. It was not thrown. It was simply stated like weather. Preston sat down. Not because he chose to, because his knees seemed to understand before his pride did. Jessica Morningside looked at the documents on her screen, then back at Vance. Was this disclosed in the acquisition materials? No, Vance said. Her face hardened. Was North Star provided with any notice of possible intellectual property, encumbrance, royalty, liability, or ownership challenge connected to the core Cedar treatment process? Number. Preston opened his mouth. Jessica raised one hand. Do not answer without counsel. Gerald Frost, Preston's own attorney, leaned toward him and said under his breath, Do not speak. Jessica sat back. For the first time, she looked genuinely angry. Until this matter is independently reviewed, North Star is suspending all acquisition activity related to Aldridge Timber. Effective immediately. Preston stared at the screen. Jessica, wait. But she was already gathering her papers. Mr. Aldridge, if these documents are authenticated, your company failed to disclose a material liability during acquisition review. That changes everything. Then she looked at Beatrice. Mrs. Aldridge, I expect my office will be contacting your attorney. Beatrice inclined her head once. Jessica closed the laptop on her end. The screen went black. That was the sound of the Empire stopping. Not crashing. Stopping. No alarms. No broken glass. No men shouting over one another. Just a dark screen at the end of a long mahogany table. Preston stared at it as if it might come back to life and forgive him. It did not. Clara stood slowly. Preston, she said, her voice low, the sale is gone. He turned on her. Not if we contest this. You can contest it, Vance said, for years, publicly. Preston said nothing. Vance continued. Patent ownership, royalty exposure, concealment, Clayton's letter, Raymond's testimony, due diligence failure, board liability. Each phrase landed with quiet precision. And while you contest it, Vance said no serious buyer will touch this company. Beatrice finally moved. She reached into the inside pocket of her wool jacket and removed a thin document packet. Not thick, not dramatic. No red stamp, no heavy binder, just several pages clipped neatly together. She placed it on the table. Preston looked at it with open suspicion. What is that? Terms, Beatrice said. The word surprised them. Preston blinked. Terms? Yes. You just destroyed the sale. No, Beatrice said. Your grandfather did that in 1979. You simply failed to read what he left behind. Clara stepped closer to the table. Beatrice touched the document packet with 2 fingers. I did not come here to destroy Aldridge Timber. Preston let out a bitter laugh. You expect us to believe that? Beatrice looked at him then, and there was no softness in her face. I expect you to listen. The room obeyed. She lifted the first page. First, the patent will be transferred into a charitable foundation named for Thomas Aldridge. The Thomas Aldridge Forestry Foundation will fund scholarships for forestry students, independent wood science research, and rural trade apprenticeships. Clara's expression changed. Something like recognition passed across her face. Beatrice continued. Second, Aldridge Timber will pay 12% of gross revenue from all future commercial use of the cedar seasoning process into that foundation. Preston looked up sharply. Future. Yes. You're not asking for back royalties. Number. The room shifted. Even Raymond lifted his head. Beatrice looked around the table. I could. Mr. Vance has explained that to me clearly. I could pursue the entire claim. I could let attorneys spend the next decade unmaking everything your family built on my husband's work. She paused. But Thomas did not love trees because he wanted to cut them all down. No one spoke. He loved them because he understood what patience could make of them. Her voice softened, but only slightly. I will not use his name to burn this company to the ground. Preston looked almost confused now. For the first time, he was dealing with a kind of power he did not understand. Beatrice turned the page. Third, Preston Aldridge will resign as CEO effective immediately. His face hardened. Number, Clara said quietly, Preston. He pointed at Beatrice. She doesn't get to decide that. Vance said no, but the board does. And after North Star withdraws after Raymond's testimony, after the disclosure failure, and after the patent claim becomes known, I suspect the board will find Mrs. Aldridge's proposal generous." Gerald Frost removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "That was answer enough," Beatrice continued. "Fourth, an independent board committee will review all executive decisions related to the concealment of Thomas's patent and the attempted sale." Preston sank back. "Fifth, Beatrice said I will hold a permanent board seat with veto authority over any future sale involving Aldridge Timber's core process intellectual property or founding assets." One of the cousins whispered, "She can't." Clara cut him off. "She can, if we agree." Beatrice looked at Clara for the first time. Clara's eyes were red but steady. Then Beatrice read the final term. "Sixth, the house Thomas built for me will be transferred into my name permanently. No allowance, no permission, no family consideration. My home." Raymond began to cry, quietly, with his head lowered and one hand covering his eyes. Beatrice did not look away from the paper. When she finished, she set it down. "That is what I want." Preston stared at her. "You could take hundreds of millions." "Yes. And instead you want a foundation, a board seat, my resignation, and that little house." Beatrice looked at the cedar box, then at the patent, then at the old letter Clayton had written when he thought Thomas was too poor to fight. "I want my husband's name attached to what he made," she said. "I want young people who love forests to have the chance Thomas should have had. I want this company to stop pretending generosity is the same thing as justice. And I want to go home without asking any Aldridge for permission." Clara walked around the table. For a moment, no one knew what she intended to do. Then she stopped beside Beatrice. "Let me help you," Clara said. Preston stared at her. "You're choosing her." Clara looked at him. "No," she said. "I'm choosing the truth before it destroys what's left." She picked up the agreement and read quickly, professionally, her legal mind moving even through emotion. "It's better than we deserve," she said. Gerald Frost leaned toward Preston. "She's right." Preston closed his eyes. The man who had entered the room intending to purchase Beatrice's silence now sat surrounded by the cost of having underestimated her. His hand shook when Frost placed a pen in front of him. "I'm not admitting—" "You already lost the sale," Clara said. "Don't lose the company." That reached him. "Not morality. Not remorse. The company." Preston picked up the pen. His signature was ugly, hard, dragged across the page like an injury. But it was there. Preston Aldridge. Then Raymond signed. Vance moved the papers to him and held the page steady while the old man gripped the pen with trembling fingers. Raymond wrote slowly. Each letter cost him something. When he finished, he looked at Beatrice. "I should have done this when Thomas died," he whispered. Beatrice did not answer. But she did not turn away. Clara signed next. Her hand was steady, not because she was calm, because she had chosen. Then the packet came to Beatrice. The room seemed to narrow around her. The mahogany table, the black screen, the patent, the cedar box. The company built on Thomas's mind. The house they had tried to take from her. 40 years of checks. 40 years of being tolerated. 40 years of knowing Thomas had left her something even before she knew what it was. Vance placed the pen beside her hand. Beatrice picked it up. For one brief second, she saw Thomas in the workshop, cedar shavings on his sleeves, smiling as if patience were not waiting at all, but faith stretched across time. Then she signed, Beatrice Aldridge, not Mrs. Thomas Aldridge, not dependent, not beneficiary, not burden. Beatrice Aldridge. For the first time in 40 years, her signature did not ask to be accepted. It changed the room. When she set the pen down, no one spoke. Outside the windows, the sky had cleared enough for sunlight to strike the glass towers across the street. Inside the boardroom, the old cedar box sat closed beside the agreement. The box had done what Thomas made it to do. It had not made Beatrice rich. It had made the truth impossible to ignore. And now, for the first time since 1979, Aldridge Timber belonged to the story it had tried to erase. 1 year later, spring came early to Oregon. It arrived first in the wet smell of the soil, then in the pale green edges of the hills, then in the white cedar blossoms that drifted across the town like quiet snow. For the first time in 40 years, Beatrice Aldridge watched the season change without waiting for something to be taken from her. She still lived in the small house Thomas had built. The roof had been repaired before winter. The porch steps no longer sagged. The kitchen window had been replaced, and in the morning sunlight came through it, cleanly falling across the old pine table where the cedar box had once sat unopened. The house had not become grand. Beatrice would not have wanted that. It remained what Thomas had made it to be, a place small enough to care for, a place strong enough to last, a place where silence no longer felt like abandonment. Every Thursday afternoon, Clara came by for tea. At first she had arrived stiffly carrying flowers or baked bread or legal papers that did not truly require Beatrice's signature. She always stood on the porch a second too long before knocking, as if she still needed permission to enter a house her family had spent decades pretending did not matter. Beatrice always opened the door before Clara could knock twice. After a few months, Clara stopped bringing excuses. She brought herself. They sat at the kitchen table or on the porch when the weather was clear. Sometimes they spoke about the foundation. Sometimes they spoke about Aldridge timber. Sometimes Clara asked about Thomas, not the company version, not the man in the brochures, but the real one. The man who forgot his coffee when he was thinking. The man who filled margins with notes. The man who could run his palm over a board of cedar and tell where the tree had grown too fast. The man who had loved Beatrice quietly, carefully, and with more patience than anyone had understood. Clara listened to those stories like someone gathering pieces of a family she had been denied. In March, the Thomas Aldridge Forestry Foundation awarded its first scholarships. The ceremony was held in the old mill hall, the same building where Thomas had once tested cedar boards late into the night, while everyone else thought he was wasting time. There were folding chairs, a modest podium, and a banner with Thomas's name printed in simple dark letters. No gold, no marble, no corporate language, just his name. Beatrice sat in the front row. Vance sat beside her. Clara sat on her other side. Raymond was there too, smaller now, wrapped in a dark coat, his wheelchair positioned near the aisle, where he could see the stage clearly. He did not speak much anymore, but when the first student's name was called, his hand moved to his eyes. The first recipient was Martin Aldridge, 28 years old. Quiet, awkward in the way of young men who have spent more time among trees than people. He walked to the stage in a borrowed suit and accepted the scholarship certificate with both hands. When he looked out and found Beatrice, his face changed. Not pride, not entitlement, gratitude. Later, he came to her with tears in his eyes. I want to study wood science, he said. Not just management, not just business, the actual material, the trees, the process. Beatrice smiled. Thomas would have liked that. Martin looked down at the certificate. I wish I had known him. Beatrice took his hand. If you do the work honestly, she said, you will. Aldridge timber did not collapse. That surprised the town more than anything. People had expected scandal to destroy it. They had expected lawsuits, resignations, public blame, and years of bitterness. There had been headlines, of course. There had been investigations. There had been statements written by attorneys and read by people who had not earned the right to sound noble. But the company survived. Changed. Smaller in its arrogance. Larger in its purpose. Preston was no longer CEO. He remained at Aldridge Timber in a reduced role under the supervision of an independent board he no longer controlled. He never came to Beatrice's door. He never apologized. But sometimes when his car passed the small house on the road outside town, Beatrice would see it slow. Once in late April, she was standing by the porch with a basket of laundry when Preston's car came around the bend. He saw her. For a second, she thought he would drive on. Instead, he stopped. He did not get out. He did not lower the window. He only looked toward the house, toward the repaired porch, toward the cedar trees behind it. Then he bowed his head. Just once. It was not enough. It was not forgiveness. But it was something the old Preston would never have done. Beatrice watched until the car moved on. Then she went back inside and finished hanging the laundry. Some changes did not need witnesses. By May, the foundation had approved funding for 3 forestry students, 1 rural apprenticeship program, and a small research grant for sustainable cedar preservation. Clara handled the legal structure. Martin volunteered on weekends. Vance complained that retirement had become busier than work. Beatrice attended every meeting. She did not speak often, but when she did, the room listened. Not because she raised her voice, because everyone knew she had waited 40 years before using it. One morning when the cedar blossoms were falling thick across the yard, Beatrice carried the old cedar box into the garden. It was empty now. The patent had been archived properly. Thomas's laboratory journals had been copied and preserved. The board minutes and Clayton's letter were stored in a secure foundation file. The box had done its work. For the first time since Thomas placed it in her hands, Beatrice did not need it to protect her. She walked to the center of the garden where a young cedar sapling stood in fresh earth. Martin had helped her plant it the week before. He had chosen the spot, carefully explaining sunlight and drainage and root space with the solemn excitement of someone who loved what he was saying. Beatrice had let him talk. Thomas had sounded like that once. Now she knelt slowly beside the sapling. Her knees did not like the ground anymore, but she lowered herself anyway. She set the empty cedar box beneath the young tree, partly in the shade, partly in the light. Not buried. Not hidden. Placed. There was a difference. She rested one hand on the lid. The wood was worn smooth where her hands had touched it for 40 years. For a long time, she said nothing. The breeze moved through the trees behind the house. Cedar blossoms drifted down and caught in her white hair on her sleeves on the dark grain of the box. Finally, Beatrice closed her eyes. "Thomas," she whispered, "I did it." Her voice trembled then. Not from fear. Not anymore. I waited. I trusted you. And I did it. The garden was quiet. But in that quiet, she could almost hear him. Not as a ghost. Not as a miracle. Only as memory. A voice kept alive because love had been patient enough to reach across 40 years. Beatrice opened the final letter one last time that afternoon. She read it on the porch while the sun lowered behind the cedars. Thomas's handwriting had faded slightly, but the words were still there. "Beatrice, my love, if you are reading this after the box has done what I hoped it would do, then I want you to understand something. I never left this burden with you because I thought you were meant to fight alone. I left it because I knew you would know the right moment. Not because you are strong, though you are stronger than anyone has ever understood, but because you are patient. And patience, my Beatrice, is the greatest strength in any long battle. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for trusting me. Now live. Truly live. For both of us." Beatrice folded the letter carefully. She did not put it back in the box. She kept it in her pocket. Then she sat on the porch as evening settled over the little house, watching the young cedar tree move gently in the spring wind. For 40 years the box had held the truth. Now the truth had roots, and Beatrice Aldridge, at 81 years old, finally allowed herself to stop waiting. She smiled. Not because everything had been restored. Some things never returned exactly as they were. But because Thomas's name was spoken again. Because the company would carry what it owed forward. Because the young would learn from what had been stolen. Because the house was hers. Because the silence had ended. And because, after all those years, Beatrice was still here. Living. Truly living. For both of them.